Why would a man end a woman's life and then return to talk to her body? That's not the question that haunted me most. The real question is why he needed to do it again. And again. Dozens of times. Gary Ridgway was no monster from a nightmare. He was a soft-spoken man who painted trucks for a living. He wore a uniform, paid his bills, and said grace before dinner. But behind that quiet smile, 49 women died, maybe more. Some say it was over 70. Others believe he stopped counting at 90. He didn't shoot. He didn't stab. He ended their lives with his own hands. Slowly, methodically, sometimes while whispering to them. Then he'd leave their bodies in forests and rivers, under bridges, places so ordinary they swallowed the horror without a sound. Seattle, the 1980s. He was known as the Green River Killer because the first 5 bodies were found in that murky water. All women, mostly sex workers. Young, vulnerable, vanished into a fog of silence and fear. Law enforcement took years, decades to catch him. Why? Because he played the part so well. He smiled, he prayed, he passed polygraphs. But I'm not here to retell the crimes. I'm here to understand why. Because a man like that doesn't just become. He's formed, molded, cracked. He's a boy long before he's a killer. And somewhere in that journey from a child wetting the bed to a man returning to corpse-littered woods, something broke. So tonight I ask you not to look at Gary Ridgway's crimes with horror, but with the quiet question. What if someone had seen him sooner? He was born into shadows, February 18, 1949, Salt Lake City, Utah. Gary Ridgway entered the world as the middle child in a home where love was whispered, but rage was loud. His father was a quiet, frustrated bus driver. His mother, Mary, was dominant, severe, and unyielding. She ruled the house with a kind of rage that didn't always need shouting. Sometimes silence cuts sharper. Gary wet the bed until he was 13. Each time his mother would clean the sheets, not with anger, but with a cold, silent disapproval. He would stand nearby feeling exposed and deeply ashamed, and then she'd undress him. Bathe him. A teenage boy. She bathed him herself even in his teenage years, not in violence, but in a silence that confused him, made him feel trapped, twisted, and something else he couldn't name. He later told detectives that he hated her, that he wanted to harm her, that he fantasized about taking control away from her, but she never hit him. She never screamed. She just hovered, scrubbed, controlled. That's how it started. Home wasn't a safe place. It was a locked room, cold tile, the sound of running water and broken dishes. And somewhere in that cold bathroom, a little boy started to split. One part wanted to be hugged, the other wanted to disappear her forever. The first crack didn't come from a scream. It came from the absence of warmth. And when a child grows up without ever hearing, "You are safe now," what kind of man does he become? They say school is where we learn who we are. But for Gary, it only taught him who he'd never be. From his earliest years in class, Gary struggled. He was a poor student, distracted, slow, often confused by the words on the page. His IQ tested around 80, not low enough to warrant help, but low enough to leave him behind. And he was left behind, again and again. His classmates mocked him for stuttering, for blank stares, for being dumb. Teachers ignored him or scolded him or pitied him, but they never saw him. Not really. He sat in the back, head down, heart smaller each year. When he spoke, no one listened. When he was silent, no one asked why. He wore the same clothes again and again, smelled of neglect. He didn't fight back, not because he didn't want to, but because he knew it wouldn't matter. And so, like many others who become invisible, Gary began building a world inside himself. One where he wasn't weak. One where he had power, one where no one laughed. When he looked at the pretty girls in class, it wasn't with love. It was with longing and resentment. He wasn't part of their world, and he never would be. By high school, he had learned 2 things. No one is coming to save you. The only way to be seen is to take something away from the world. He would smile for the school photo, but behind his eyes, a quiet vow had formed. Someday they'll notice me. Something shifted when he turned 14. It didn't happen all at once, but you could feel it like a room growing colder one silent degree at a time. Gary started talking to himself, whispering under his breath, mouthing silent arguments no one else could hear. At first, people thought it was nervousness, but it wasn't. It was rehearsal, a place where he could finally win. He began stealing small things at first, trinkets from neighbors, food from school lunches, just enough to feel the thrill, to feel something. He lied constantly about his grades, his plans, his dreams. But what disturbed those around him most wasn't what he did. It was the way he didn't care. And then came the stabbing. At 16, Gary led a 6-year-old boy into the woods. No one knows exactly why. Some say he was imitating violence he'd seen at home. Others say it was a test of control. He injured a boy with a sharp object and walked away. The boy survived. But Gary never truly explained why he did it. He simply said he wanted to know what it felt like to end someone's life. It was puberty, but it was more than hormones. It was the quiet blooming of darkness, twisted by years of confusion, neglect, and buried rage. And underneath it all was conflict. He still wanted love, still wanted a normal life. But something inside him had already learned to fake it. Fake smiles, imitated empathy, pretended to bond. It was the beginning of the mask. And the scariest thing about wearing a mask, eventually, you forget it's not your real face. He got a job, he got married, he smiled in photos. From the outside, Gary Ridgway became a man like any other. He joined the Navy, served in Vietnam, came home, got hired as a spray painter for trucks at Kenworth. Reliable, punctual, the kind of employee who never made trouble. He married young twice, had a son, went to church, handed out Bible tracts on street corners, told neighbors they should repent. He was by all appearances a man who had found his path. But inside, nothing. Gary was hollow. He didn't feel love the way others did. He mimicked it, studied it like a foreign language. He learned when to nod, when to say I'm sorry, when to kiss. But it was never real. It was always acting. He became a master of performance. He could look you in the eye and make you feel safe, while already picturing how to make you disappear. He knew which parts of himself to hide, which urges to smother, and which lies to tell to keep you looking the other way. And the more he fit in, the more he resented the people who believed the act. Especially the women, especially the ones who loved too easily. To him they were weak, naive, disposable. He didn't want to connect to them. He wanted to dominate, control, make them stay still, forever. But he still smiled, still prayed, still passed polygraphs. So the question becomes, when a man wears a perfect mask for long enough, who are we really shaking hands with? Up. Everyone has a moment, the one that tips the scale. For Gary Ridgway, it wasn't just one insult. It was years of slow humiliation, but there was a final fracture. Something snapped around 1980. By then, his second marriage was crumbling. His wife accused him of frequenting sex workers. She wasn't wrong. Gary had developed an obsession not with love but with control disguised as desire. He would pay women, then later condemn them for what they gave him. But the night that marked the end came when one of them laughed. Just a small laugh, nothing cruel, nothing loud. But to Gary it echoed, mocked, reduced him to what he always feared he was nothing. That laugh wasn't just about him. It was about every time he'd been ignored, every time he'd begged silently for warmth, and got nothing but cold water and criticism. That laugh, her face in the dark, shattered the mask from the inside. And something darker took over. He began to plan. He'd take them to the woods, make them feel safe, pretend to care. Then take their lives slowly. Sometimes while they begged. Sometimes after whispering lies about love or salvation. It wasn't just about ending life. It was about punishing. Not just the woman in front of him, but every woman who had ever made him feel powerless. Including the one who bathed him in silence, including the girls in school who never saw him. And so he chose a river. Cold, quiet, no judgment. The world had laughed. Now he would make it quiet. It didn't feel the way he thought it would. It wasn't rage. It wasn't even pleasure. It was silence. The first time Gary Ridgway wrapped his hands around a woman's throat, the world seemed to pause. The trees didn't move. The wind didn't blow. Her eyes stared into his wide with confusion and something else he never forgot: trust. For a moment she had still trusted him, and he crushed it. There was no screaming, just the sound of leaves beneath their bodies, her struggling hands. Then nothing. That stillness, the moment when life leaves the body, became addictive. To you and me, that sounds horrific. But to Gary, it felt like control. For once in his life, he wasn't the weak boy being scrubbed in the bathtub. He wasn't the outsider in the back of the class. He wasn't the man being laughed at in a parking lot. He was in charge. He didn't act for blood. He acted for the silence that followed. Afterward, he would talk to the body, sometimes apologize, sometimes scold. He treated them like broken dolls, unmoving, unjudging, perfect. And if the darkness in him was still hungry, he'd return. Days later, drawn by something beyond memory, he didn't always remember their names, but he remembered the feeling. The moment they stopped moving, that was when everything inside him finally quieted. And that's what kept him going. It wasn't the act itself, it was the stillness. He went home, ate dinner, kissed his wife. That's what's most disturbing to people, the normalcy. After taking a life, Gary Ridgway could return to his quiet home in South Seattle, mow the lawn, help his son with homework, and sleep soundly. No nightmares, no guilt, just routine. But inside, something had changed. The first act didn't satisfy him, it unlocked him. It gave him permission. It showed him that death could be quiet, even beautiful in a twisted way, that people could disappear and the world wouldn't notice. And so he kept going. He started targeting women who wouldn't be missed. Sex workers, runaways, girls who lived on the edge of the city and the edge of society. He chose them because he believed no one cared. That made it easier. Justify it. Numb it. But there was a ritual to it. Gary often returned to the scenes. Days later, weeks, he would talk to them, touch them, in some cases engage in disturbing post-mortem behavior. He said once in a cold interview, "I ended the lives of so many women, I have a hard time keeping them straight." That wasn't memory loss, that was detachment. He wasn't trying to forget. He simply never cared to remember. Each time the act became less about pain and more about pattern. Control, quiet, release. He didn't feel remorse. He didn't feel triumph. He just felt free. For the first time in his life, no one could touch him. And that feeling, it became his addiction. It ended without a fight. November 30th, 2001, Kenworth Truck Plant, Auburn, Washington. Gary Ridgway was at work wearing his uniform, ready to clock in when detectives approached. He didn't run, didn't scream, didn't even blink. They told him he was under arrest for the deaths of 4 women. He said, "Okay," just like that. It had taken almost 20 years. DNA technology finally caught up to him. A single drop of saliva preserved on evidence from the early 80s was enough to link him. In the interrogation room, he was calm, polite, cooperative. His voice never rose. His hands never shook. He answered questions with a casual tone, sometimes even smiling. He confessed to ending the lives of 49 women, but later he hinted at more. Maybe 60, maybe 70, he said. The exact number didn't matter to him. What stood out most was not what he said, but how he said it. There was no rage, no joy, just facts, a kind of mechanical reflection like reading off a list of chores. One detective asked him if he felt remorse. Gary looked up, paused, and said, "I'm sorry for not being honest earlier."
Not sorry for the deaths, sorry for the delay.
Sitting in his cell, Gary kept a Bible. He still prayed, still claimed to believe in God, but the mask had slipped now. There were no more neighbors to fool, no more women to manipulate. Just him and silence. And when the mask was gone, what was left? A man with a calm face and a storm no one ever heard. Gary Ridgway didn't begin with blood. He began with silence. Not the silence of his victims, but the silence of the world around him when he was a child crying in the bathroom, when he was a teenager talking to himself in a corner, when he attacked a little boy at 16 and was simply released. No one truly saw him, not then. People say monsters are born, others say they're made. But the truth is, quieter monsters are missed. Gary wasn't a genius. He didn't cover his tracks with brilliance. He wasn't especially strong or fast or clever. What made him deadly was how forgettable he was. He knew how to blend in, how to speak just enough, how to smile just right. And when society doesn't care to look deeper, a mask is all it takes. When he pleaded guilty to 49 deaths in exchange for avoiding the death penalty, he showed no emotion, no breakdown, no tears, just that familiar, unreadable calm. We look at men like him and wonder how they fooled us. But the better question is, how long did we ignore them first? Gary Ridgway's story isn't just about evil. It's about what happens when no one listens, when a boy's pain goes unanswered, when a young man's sickness festers in private, when the people we overlook start looking back at us through broken glass. And the most haunting truth:
There are more out there, not monsters in the shadows, but men in uniforms, in churches, in homes, sitting quietly, smiling politely,
waiting to be seen.